Welcome everyone. My name is Rosa Cabrera. I'm the director of the Latino Cultural Center at UIC, better known as the LCC. And thank you for joining us this afternoon for our Climates of Inequality online conversation series with local environmental and climate justice leaders. I would like to do a quick access check just to make sure that your audio is okay. Please let us know with a thumbs up or some kind of reaction if you can hear us. Okay. Also, let us know if you're able to access the caption option on Zoom. If you have any questions about accessibility during our program, please put that on the chat and one of the LCC staff will help you on how to access that. So the Climates of Inequality series is featuring 7 online presentations this fall, where guest speakers will be highlighting how frontline communities in the Chicago region who are impacted by environmental pollution and climate change, and more recently COVID-19, are demanding justice and putting forward a vision to create healthier and safer communities. In this series, we have been underscoring the legacies of colonialism and how these continue to shape contemporary environmental challenges such as climate change and the pollution of land, air, and water, disproportionately affecting Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. For decades, environmental racism and failing physical and economic infrastructures have distressed and rearranged these communities, revealing a climate crisis that results from both extreme climate conditions and the social reality of the people. So today's presentation will be a snapshot of devastating events that has led to a humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico, where disaster capitalism seeks to undermine the rebuilding of the island by the Puerto Rican people wishing to shape a collective future that can be self-sustained. Before we start the presentation, a few shout outs to our partners, the Humanities Action Lab, where the Climates of Inequality Traveling Exhibition Project resides, and organizations Alianza Americas and Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, known as Unveil, for collaborating with the LCC to create a local story resisting of environmental injustice in La Villita, which you can check out in the LCC website. I believe that the link has been shared on the chat or will be shared soon by one of the staff. Also, a shout out to the co-sponsors, the UIC Sustainability Fee, the Department of Anthropology, Las Ganas Program, Latin American and Latino Studies, Latin American Recruitment and Educational Services, LARES, Museum and Exhibition Studies, the School of Art and Art History, and we have a few student organizations, and these are Alpha Psi, Lambda Zeta Chapter, Hope for the Day, Latinx Graduate Student Association, Roosevelt Network, Students for Justice in Palestine, and the Union for Puerto Rican Students. Also to the student panelists in my environmental and climate justice class, let's see, they are Olga Delgado Cano, Carlos Reina, and Romarina Cortez. The presentation will be for about 35 minutes or so, followed by a short question answer kind of conversation between the presenter and panelists. All you who are participating but don't have access to the presenter, please, you're welcome to put any comments or any resource or any questions on the chat. So now I'm thrilled to introduce our guest speaker, Jessie Fuentes. activist in the Humboldt Park community in Chicago. She's a graduate of Dr. Pedro Alviso Campos Puerto Rican High School, where she's now the Dean of Student Affairs. Jessie has done work around empowering young people in the community, the release of Oscar Lopez Rivera, anti-gentrification work, education reform, and the independence of Puerto Rico. Her political work began as the director of a youth organization in Humboldt Park called the Batey Urbano, and she's a firm believer that a more just world is possible through cultural, relevant, and meaningful curriculum. Jessie has a bachelor's degree in Justice Studies and Latino and Latin American Studies, and has also earned her master's degree in Community and Educational Leadership. Through her social justice work, Jessie strives to be a principal that will fight against all injustices impacting the life of young people. Welcome to our virtual community, Jessie. It's all yours.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's always a privilege to be able to come to UIC and be able to speak on the work that I think is so important, but also ensuring that courses at UIC are geared towards activism and creating a more just world. I'm going to share my screen here, and then my panelists can let me know if we see this okay. No? Okay, so let's see here. Now? Do you see it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so let me just go into present mode. And then do we all see this here? Good, perfect. All right. So there's a couple of things that I want to share. I am, as Profesora Cabrera articulated, I'm an activist in the Humboldt Park community. My most recent political work has been as the co-chair of the Puerto Rican Agenda of Chicago. We belong to a national organization that really believes in providing just and equitable resources for Puerto Ricans in the diaspora and on the island. In the last 3 years, we have been particularly involved in ensuring that we can rebuild Puerto Rico after some of the most devastating events that Puerto Rico has faced in the last 100 years. And so just briefly, I want to talk about some of the things that we have been able to accomplish. And then I want to go right into what is happening in Puerto Rico, what hasn't been done, and what we can do as activists from the diaspora. So in Puerto Rico, we launched a campaign called 3 R's for Puerto Rico. It was rescue, relief, and rebuild. And as many of you can imagine, after everything that's happened in Puerto Rico, the rebuilding phase has taken the diaspora and people of Puerto Rico much longer than anyone has anticipated or would want. When we launched the campaign in Puerto Rico, we sent 2 airplanes 2 weeks after Hurricane Maria. Those airplanes included basic survival materials that people in Puerto Rico at that moment needed. When we sent those 2 planes full of materials, we were able to return a plane full of Puerto Rican refugees that we have housed here in Chicago in the Humboldt Park area. We have 362 residents that still live in Chicago that had come right after Hurricane Maria. We have partnered with local mayors that we still have long relationships with to continue the rebuilding aspect of Puerto Rico. And having that relationship with local personnel is super important because we truly understand the needs of the people in Puerto Rico, and it's not basic information, it's coming from the central government. I think that one of the most prized possessions that we are part of, and I'll touch on it a little later and why it's necessary, we have built a climate-resistant and solar-powered home in Comerillo, Puerto Rico, that was fully funded by the Puerto Rican Agenda to be a model home of what is needed all across the island. And we'll talk about why that's important in terms of climate change and the direction that Puerto Rico has been headed in the last 200 years. Our overall investment has been $375,000 just in rebuilding efforts. There was 2 pillars prior to rebuilding, which was the rescue and the relief. in rebuilding alone, we have invested this dollar amount, and that has all come from individual donors. Every dollar that the Puerto Rican Agenda received has been from students from UIC, Union for Puerto Rican Students, doing fundraisers on campus, other organizations at other universities, and young people really coming together to ensure that this is possible. It's always why, for me, it's a privilege to be able to come back to UIC, because an organization like UPRS has a special place with the Puerto Rican Agenda. And so I appreciate you all being here and having me today. Let's see here. All right. So I want to talk about 5 events that have happened in the last 3 years. In September of 2017, we were all made aware of a hurricane that was going to hit Puerto Rico, and that was Hurricane Irma. Hurricane Irma had hit Puerto Rico. It had damaged its central power system. It had damaged over 70,000 homes and created floods all over the island. What Puerto Ricans didn't expect was that a more devastating hurricane was going to hit Puerto Rico 2 weeks later. Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and completely deteriorated its infrastructure. Everything from roads, bridges, completely taking out the power system and leaving many homes without roofs, many homes without legs. If you go to Puerto Rico, you know that many homes are very close to the beach. And because we are consistently in a place where there are rising sea levels, many homes sit on pillars, wood pillars, and many homes we've seen destabilized by the hurricane. In 2019, 2 years after Hurricane Maria, as the island is still trying to build itself up, be resilient, live in community, and try to survive without the support and the relief of federal government, there was a major scandal with former Governor Rosselló. For those of you guys who don't know, there are 876 pages worth of text messages between Governor Rosselló and the main members of his cabinet having conversations about what this relief process would look like and their opinions of the people of Puerto Rico and elected officials on the island side and the state side. Just to give you a picture, there were comments in those text messages making jokes about the cadavers that were piling up because of how many people were dying from the lack of power and water after Hurricane Maria. There was a comment about former Speaker of New York, Melissa Mark Viverito, being called a whore because she had criticized the type of aid that was being provided to the poor communities in Puerto Rico. People in Puerto Rico protested all over the streets of San Juan, specifically right in front of La Fortaleza, demanding the resignation of Rosselló. You have to imagine what that dynamic is like. People in Puerto Rico had been living 2 years. At this point in 2019, there's still over 200,000 homes with blue roofs, and that is homes that still have not been rebuilt, have not received the assistance of FEMA, but have blue tarps and they don't have fully sustainable homes. These are people who still have not gone back to school because several schools have been closed. People have not gone back to work. People are still living off of small FEMA packages of meals that contained, and many of us seen it on the news, the boxes of meals contained Doritos, Oreos, soda, nothing nutritional, no type of food that the people of Puerto Rico needed. And there they were being made fun of, being poked at, being embarrassed by the very person who is supposed to be providing aid and rebuilding the island. But he had utilized many of the funds that was provided to the central government for the rebuilding of Puerto Rico to fund the pockets of friends, to continue funding major corporations and leaving the people of Puerto Rico in the dark without homes and without clean water. Now, those protests lasted for weeks, and ultimately they were able to unseat Rosselló. Rosselló is the only governor who has been unseated by the participatory democracy of the people of the island. And they made history, and they proved to people of Puerto Rico that they demanded transparency, that they demanded true leadership. At the end of 2019, in December, and in the beginning of 2020, Puerto Rico gets hit with one of the largest magnitude earthquakes that they had seen in about a century. A 6.4 magnitude earthquake that hit the southwestern region of Puerto Rico. Now, Puerto Rico is positioned in a very unique plate in which it is on top of active tectonic plates that are consistently shifting. So earthquakes to Puerto Rico is not new. Often, if you are in Puerto Rico throughout the year, you feel tremors. And that's because you understand that those tectonic plates are shifting. But a 6.4 magnitude earthquake quite literally feels like Puerto Rico is cracking apart from beneath your feet. And now that earthquake unhoused 70,000 more people. There were 70,000 people in the southwestern region of Puerto Rico that were living in tents. I had the privilege of going to Puerto Rico in February to be able to launch another campaign for Relief and Rebuild, in which we were able to witness a lot of the damage that was done. And so the picture that you see here that's in the background of the PowerPoint that will consistently play is the picture of what it looked like after the earthquake, right? And now here we are, it's 2020. There are still about 70,000 people without homes. There is still not a fully built power grid system, and Puerto Rico got hit with COVID-19. COVID-19 has caused the largest unemployment rate that Puerto Rico has ever seen. And there is no real plan, as we even see here on the state side, to have a comprehensive plan to deal and grapple and resolve the issue of the pandemic. And unfortunately, Puerto Rico is one of the places that has the highest positivity rates, as well as with many hospitals beds filled, no capacity, lack of ventilators, lack of treatment, and lack of testing. Meanwhile, all of this has happened in the last 3 years, and Puerto Rico is dealing with a $70 billion debt and with a colonial fiscal control board that is unelected, was appointed by Obama, that has raised taxes, cut wages, closed schools, has refused to rebuild an infrastructure, all in the name of paying a debt that has not been audited. We have no idea if this debt was caused by the people of Puerto Rico and should be paid by the people of Puerto Rico. So climate change is important when we're discussing the issue of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico sits on a hurricane belt. It is without a shadow of a doubt that Puerto Rico will always experience a hurricane and can be devastated by a hurricane. Now, the temperatures of the water in Puerto Rico have raised an entire degree. Now, we have to understand that when the waters of Puerto Rico, that sea level, when it's warm, it gives hurricanes the active energy to completely wipe out the entire island, right? And so we have to be able to grapple with what's happening in the water. What are we doing to cause the waters to get warmer? And then what is it that we need to cut back on so that we don't create sea levels that are giving energy and activity to hurricanes to not be able to be slowed down when they're in the water? Now, the impact that Hurricane Maria had on Puerto Rico, outside of the homes that were damaged, outside of many people being without clean water, we have to understand the gap that was created between the wealthy and between the poor, right? We've seen it very clearly in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, which were the first towns to be rebuilt. San Juan, right? All of your resorts on the seaside, Dorado, which was one of the richest towns in Puerto Rico because corporate money is funneled into those towns. Meanwhile, you have towns like Guanica, you have towns like Comerillo, towns like Caguas, who have no investment. These are towns that if you go into Puerto Rico, you can still see much of the debris from Hurricane Maria. And Hurricane Maria took place 3 years ago. And these are towns and families who are rebuilding their homes and islands on their own. You're talking about families who are building their homes brick by brick with their own hands because they didn't get FEMA approval, because they didn't have the municipal funding that the governor didn't allocate to those particular towns. And then we have to grapple with the lack of reporting on the deaths, right? So this number that I have here in this PowerPoint, 4,645 deaths caused by Hurricane Irma and Maria, that is a number that people on the diaspora side have latched onto through a Harvard research that said that 2,000 number that Puerto Rico, until still to this day, if you look on Puerto Rico's website, if you look at anything that Puerto Rico has put out in terms of the fatalities of Hurricane Maria, they still linger to that 2,000 number. And that was also a part of the scandal from the Rosselló text messages, right? Not wanting to truly grapple with being transparent. Well, what Puerto Rico didn't take into account is all of your patients that were on ventilators, all of your patients that needed dialysis, all of your patients that needed to be on insulin and needed energy and power to truly be healthy and to check their metrics to ensure that they had what they needed to stay alive, did not have it after Hurricane Maria. And no one was taking that into account. And so when we latch on to that number, 4,645, what we are saying is everyone who has died after Hurricane Maria that had severe illnesses before Hurricane Maria, their deaths are due to the fact that Puerto Rico was not rebuilt and not sustained and not given the energy and the funding to be able to ensure that their people can survive. And that is something that the central government of Puerto Rico does not want to take into account. Furthermore, when you do the research on the people who have passed away after Hurricane Maria, you have to be able to take a real look at their demographics. Where do they come from? What towns do they live in? Who are they? And when you look at that, you see that the poorest people of Puerto Rico are the people we are talking about when we're talking about 4,645 fatalities. We're not talking about your people with money. We're not talking about your gringos who have moved to the island after retirement. You are talking about people who are merely surviving and they did not get what they need because Puerto Rico has been a forgotten colonial property. There is this video that I want to show you. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a congresswoman out of the Bronx. And she has most recently signed on a bill with Nidia Velázquez. And that bill specifically talks about Puerto Rico as a colonial property of the United States and the need to create a process that truly allows the self-determination of Puerto Rico. This bill does not say statehood. This bill does not say independence. This bill does not say continue the status quo of Commonwealth. It says allow a process for real self-determination to take place. And I think it's super important in terms of understanding the relationship of Puerto Rico and the United States to watch.
I was at school. The principal told me that I had to leave completely and that I couldn't come back unless I changed my hair.
When society has abandoned you, it completely shapes your worldview.
We have this situation in an area of the country that you are obviously very familiar with, Puerto Rico. We have had Hurricane Maria, that earthquake last year. I want to ask you two questions. I want, to the extent that you can, I would like you to speak to the conditions in Puerto Rico right now, this administration's response to those conditions, and what it says about us that we can kill 250,000 people and spend $6 trillion and have the response that we've had to Americans.
I think in terms of the physical impact on Puerto Rico, I think that's something that many of us either know or can imagine, that there was never any recovery from the infrastructure damage in Hurricane Maria, which was primed and positioned for thousands of people to die because of the Promesa Act, which has basically promised any investment generated by the island goes to Wall Street before it goes to our schools, before it goes to our hospitals, which just kind of primed the infrastructure for an intense amount of destruction after Maria. And the earthquakes, of course, exacerbated that. But I think the story that's not told is the impact on our collective psyche on the island. No one believes that the United States treats us as full citizens, because the United States doesn't. And there's almost kind of an apocalyptic mentality. That earthquake hit, and my own family, it's like they had all of these emergency backpacks ready to go with torches and MREs and rations, because they knew that no one was going to come. And that's the psyche. And to know that a society does not care for you has a profound impact on one's psyche. And it's true. And whether it's in Puerto Rico, or whether it's the Bronx, whether it's Baltimore, or whether it's in any number of communities, when society has abandoned you, it completely shapes your worldview. And also, in terms of my own family, my grandfather died right in the wake of Maria. And my grandmother is now there. She's oxygen dependent. And when the power goes out, we don't know what's going to happen to her every time. And so that instability, which is a similar kind of instability when you don't have health insurance, when your family can't afford insulin, when these basic tenets of human dignity are not afforded for certain people. Yet you see the United States Congress approve the largest military budget in years when we're not even at war, allegedly. It tells you that the destruction of humanity is a higher priority than the preservation and advancement of humanity.
I will stop it.
When society has abandoned.
So I'll stop it there, because I want to be able to save some really good time for questions, but also continue to talk a little bit. I will say this, right? To talk about Puerto Rico and its colonial status can be an entire semester course. To talk about the devastation of these natural disasters and what it means to be climate conscious can take an entire semester. And so what I'm trying to do is give you a snapshot of everything that has happened in Puerto Rico and what may be needed, right? So, and AOC in the video alludes to it, the types of things that Hurricane Maria unveiled in its wake, right? But we have to root it in some history, right? Because it wasn't just Hurricane Maria that caused colonialism to hit the island smack upside the head, right? The colonial reality of Puerto Rico was always there. What Hurricane Maria did was put a spotlight on it. We have to consider what were some of the insular cases, some of the acts that were imposed on Puerto Rico that caused these tenets, right? In 1901, insular cases that articulate the 4-Acre Act of Puerto Rico articulates that Puerto Rico belongs to, but is not a part of the United States. Now, this sweatshirt that I'm wearing, this belongs to me. My hand is a part of me. If I sever my hand at its risk, I am at risk of bleeding out and not surviving. Now, this shirt, Puerto Rico, I can burn it, I can toss it, and it has no impact to my wholeness. This is Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States. And so when Hurricane Maria devastated the island, the need to rebuild it, the need to invest in it, did not impact the wholeness of the United States. Therefore, Puerto Rico was not a priority. And Puerto Rico is still a forgotten island that belongs to the United States. And so we have to understand that relationship to understand why is Puerto Rico in the situation and in its positionality that it is today. And that is because that has been written into law. It is constitutional. That position that Puerto Rico is in is intentional. It's not by accident, it's by design. And that is what AOC alludes to. And that's why AOC and Nidia Velázquez put forward a bill that really talks about the self-determination of the island. We have to talk about why did FEMA show up to Texas after the hurricane that devastated Harvey and fully rebuild, and then FEMA went to Puerto Rico and gave people Doritos, right? We have to talk about that relation. We can't ignore that. But in order to truly create some sustainable and systemic change, we have to understand that dynamic and that relationship. And it takes a lot to understand, but I think if we understand where it's rooted in history and some of the insular cases that have truly impacted Puerto Rico, we can recognize it. The 4-Acre Act that makes Puerto Rico colonial property of the United States, the Jones Act that allows Puerto Ricans to become citizens and then serve in the army and military and become the frontliners of every war since, and then the Promesa Act that puts forward the Fiscal Control Board that determines that Puerto Rico and the working class of Puerto Rico pays for a debt that's unaudited and that I would bet my mortgage on was caused by corporations but has to be paid by the people. And so I want us to be able to keep that systemic intent in our minds as we think about what's happening in Puerto Rico. The impact of the earthquake is still very present in the southwestern region of Puerto Rico. One of the things that many people in Puerto Rico hoped for when the earthquake hit Puerto Rico is that the power plant would not be damaged in the southwestern region, because although the earthquake was only positioned in a quarter of the island, that power plant removed the power from the entire island because that power system is a deteriorating system. The people of Puerto Rico that are a part of the power dynamic and ensuring that that thing stays up have been saying for decades that the entire system needed to be reworked, needed to be rebuilt, but there was no investment. And so when the earthquake hit, it took out power for everyone. And what people need to understand about Puerto Rico often is if you don't have power, you don't have clean water. Without clean water, you're dehydrated and it's hard to survive on the island, right? And so what do we see today after Hurricane Maria and the earthquake is that there are many homes without roofs. And when a storm comes, guess what? That storm está dentro tu casa. Your entire house is wet. Your furniture is wet. You are figuring out how to dry everything the next day because you don't have a roof. We have still people who, like AOC mentions, who are dependent on oxygen machines and ventilators. And when that power goes out, you pray they can survive those couple of hours. And then we have to talk about how expensive and how scarce things like generators are. Not everyone in Puerto Rico can afford a generator. And that's something that we have heard often from the diaspora. But why don't you go buy a generator, buy a backup system, as if people in Puerto Rico can afford a generator and afford a backup system, right? We often speak from a position of privilege, and we have to remove that lens in order to truly understand what's happening in Puerto Rico. So, and I alluded to it in many parts of this presentation, Puerto Rico still has a deteriorating infrastructure. There are roads all over Puerto Rico that have not been rebuilt. There are bridges that take you from one town to another that have not been rebuilt. That means that the people that live in El Campo and up in the mountains, they haven't been able to come down. They haven't been able to leave those towns because there is no road or bridge that allows them to leave. We are still talking about a power system that does not work. We are talking about schools that have not been rebuilt. Thousands of young people have not been able to sit in a classroom for 3 years because the government refused to invest in its rebuilding. We have the University of Puerto Rico, who had, before Hurricane Maria, was disinvested in, then completely damaged by Hurricane Maria, and a refusal to invest in its rebuilding. There were amazing doctors and lawyers that came from Puerto Rico. And now no one's coming out of the University of Puerto Rico today. That is something we have to talk about when we talk about a scarcity of doctors on the island. When we talk about people not being able to have access to the emergency room or a clinic, we have to talk about we have not rebuilt our schools to produce our doctors. And after Hurricane Maria, many of our doctors left the island. We have to talk about the 300,000 people that are currently unemployed because of Hurricane Maria, because of the earthquakes, and because of the pandemic. And yet all of this is still happening with a $74 billion debt that is still being charged on the working class of Puerto Rico. Now, I know that sounds like a very dark picture, almost like what today has looked like, extremely gloomy, right? But I promise you that it's not all bad. In Puerto Rico, there is something that happened after Hurricane Maria that is undeniable. The people of Puerto Rico have become politicized. They're resilient. They're ready for a fight. And like AOC said, there's something that's ingrained in their psyche that says, no one is going to come and help me. And so what we've seen in Puerto Rico is communities helping each other. What we've seen is the mayor of Comerillo taking 70 and 80 people that he knows works construction in his town and taking them all over Puerto Rico to help rebuild. What we've seen is someone like Carmen Yulín, the mayor of San Juan, going all over Puerto Rico and utilizing some of her funding and some of her resources to help rebuild municipalities in Puerto Rico that are less fortunate and do not have the funding source. But more importantly, what we've also seen is a consciousness here in the diaspora. And I'll never forget, after Hurricane Maria, organizations like Union for Puerto Rican Students, Que Onde Sola, Oye PR, the Puerto Rican Agenda, Hispanic Federation, Power for Puerto Rico, all organizations on the diaspora side working together despite political disagreements. Now, what we also have to understand is that specifically in the diaspora, just like in Puerto Rico, organizations belong to a status spectrum, right? We have Puerto Rican organizations that believe in the independence of Puerto Rico. We have organizations that believe in the statehood of Puerto Rico. In rebuilding Puerto Rico, that status doesn't matter. And the amount of collectivity and unity that we've seen on the island and in the diaspora to really rebuild a place that many of us call home has been priority. And it's been a beautiful thing to see even someone like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Nydia Velázquez, who do not agree politically, to put forward a bill that says the self-determination of Puerto Rico matters. And we must work together to do that. And so there are so many great things that are happening, including wanting to talk about Puerto Rico in this event tonight, right? It is wanting to build that consciousness that we see the light at the end of the tunnel for Puerto Rico. What are some of the things that we can do? Well, I think that we have to pay close attention to what is happening in Puerto Rico and some of the decisions that we make. You know, we have to make personal shifts. For example, I own a home and I made a choice to go solar, right? We have to make contributions to ensuring that we sustain the planet that we live on. In order to do so, we have to educate ourselves on what is the damage being done and what are personal things that we can change. You know, when you're gonna go take a shower, don't turn the water on before you're in the tub. Conserve that water, right? Especially your hot water. And so there's a lot to be done in terms of raising our consciousness on how do we build a better planet? How are we climate conscious? And then how do we do that on a personal level? And then how do we make it systemic? I think that there are a lot of people who were just elected last week who truly believe in climate change, right? And so I think that there's some great things to come in terms of what it means to conserve our planet. But I also think that if you live in the diaspora, you have to be able to utilize your voting power. What a lot of people don't know is the people of Puerto Rico, their vote does not impact who's elected to the House, who's elected to the Senate, or who is the president that determines the future of their own island. People of Puerto Rico don't have voting rights. And so if you belong to the Puerto Rican diaspora, always remember you vote for you and your family at home. You vote for you and every Puerto Rican that needs systemic change but can't vote for it, right? There's a consciousness that needs to be built there. I also think that it is important to invest in Puerto Rico's economy right now. And I don't mean go visit, because it's not the time to visit during a pandemic. But I mean, if you're gonna buy Christmas gifts or you're gonna buy jewelry or you're gonna buy art, consider investing in people in Puerto Rico. Consider buying something from the island right? And having it shipped. Consider investing in their economy as they're struggling to financially sustain themselves. I mean, Puerto Rico is literally drowning between sea and ocean levels, financially and physically, right? And so we have to consider, what are we doing to help keep Puerto Rico afloat? And of course, I've been on every COVID-19 committee and gearing council for Puerto Rico and here in the diaspora, and it is extremely important to follow CDC guidelines, but more importantly, Puerto Rico is La Isla del Encanto, and many people want to go to Puerto Rico for Christmas break. Many people want to go to Puerto Rico to vacation. Many people want to go to Puerto Rico to be on the beach. It's not the time to do that right now, right? The positivity rates in Puerto Rico are much higher than it needs to be. There are plenty of people who have diabetes, who have heart conditions, who are already depending on ventilators, to have people come from the United States and be spreading COVID. And so I ask you guys to be conscious of how you choose to help, and who you are in that process with. So I will allow time for questions because I'm sure there are plenty. And thank you guys for having me. I am going to stop sharing my screen so that we may see each other.
Thank you, Jessie. We're going to open it up now for the panelists to ask questions or make comments or build on what Jessie shared here tonight. And and if anyone wants to put any questions on the chat or any comments, feel free to do that, please. I'm sorry, Olga.
No, I apologize. Well, I want to thank you, Jessie, for just a wonderful presentation. And it's one thing to hear it in the news, but to hear it from a first person, like the information that you provided. Yeah, it's really so powerful. And the question that I have for you is the 360 residents that you guys flew from Puerto Rico to Chicago, where are they living?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we brought back all of these refugees in partnership with the Puerto Rican Cultural Center in Humboldt Park. It's a nonprofit agency in partnership with the Chicago Housing Association, CHA, and in partnership with Hispanic Housing. And so when we brought those refugees back, there were several housing developments that were in play by CHA, by Hispanic Housing, by Lucha, and by Bickerdike, which are all affordable housing projects in the northwest side of Chicago. One of them in Humboldt Park, one of them in Logan Square, and then one on the border of Humboldt Park and Hermosa. And so for those of us who are property owners, I'm a property owner, many activists are property owners in the Humboldt Park area, we had units available that we ensured that we would give to refugees for several months for free while we helped them financially sustain themselves and get jobs. And then we were able to create an emergency waiting list with Hispanic Housing and Lucha. And so we were able to move all of the refugees to the top of the list to get affordable housing units with our housing sector organizations. And so they're all living in the northwest side of Chicago. They all have jobs. We have been tracking all of their data and ensuring that, we help sustain them. But more importantly, we know that it's important that every single one of those individuals go back to Puerto Rico. They're not meant to stay here. Now, some of them want to, it is their decision, but they belong at home and they're climate refugees. And we have to do everything that we can to ensure that they are building themselves financially to be able to go back home.
Thank you.
Yeah, excuse me, I had a question. You mentioned one that some of the first places to be rebuilt were like the more populous cities like San Juan and the resorts. And you also mentioned that you had partnerships across the island with different mayors and different municipalities. I was wondering if you could share that information. I'm really curious what municipalities that you had partnerships with.
Yeah, so I'm going to put the Puerto Rican Agenda website in the chat. We have an interactive map on our website that shows you all of the places we invested in and who we invested in, whether they were nonprofit agencies, whether we gave those funds directly to the local mayors. And that interactive map, what it shows you is the relationships that we've built and who is currently in the process of having those partnerships to build those. So I'm going to share our website because all of that information is there. We've been very transparent as an organization in Chicago because there's a lot of funding problems with nonprofits in the city of Chicago. We've been very transparent with how we spent our money, who we've spent it on, and what did it go to. So I'll put that here for you guys and feel free to use it. Also, we are always looking for members, and so we have monthly meetings you can join as well.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I have family that still lives over there, and so I'm curious to see if there's resources that I can share with them as they continue to rebuild their houses and live their lives.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me make sure I share this with panelists and attendees. There you guys go.
Thanks again, Jessie, for this presentation. It's been very informative. I was just wondering, just like what sort of challenges there are towards trying to get people in the diaspora to go back to Puerto Rico. And you mentioned that there's somewhat of a disparity in terms of people's economic situation. And I'm wondering, how that might influence an attempt to rebuild in a sustainable way that doesn't just cater to capital.
Yeah, no, that is a phenomenal question. And it's nuanced, right? Because there's so many factors to consider. I think that we have to understand the trauma that came from Hurricane Maria and Irma and people who came after the earthquakes, of being on an island and not having control of what may hit that island and what may take you out, right? And so that there's that risk factor of being in a place where a natural disaster is, the event from living and not. And then I think there's some more complex things to consider when thinking about why people don't want to go back to Puerto Rico. There is a $74 billion debt, and there have been some major austerity measures taken on the island. We have had hospitals closed, schools closed, teachers laid off, the universities disinvested in and shut down. People that come from Puerto Rico don't see a future in Puerto Rico with this debt in place and with the austerity measures in place. There's a fiscal control board that was unelected. I mean, we also have to consider that the working class of Puerto Rico is paying for the debt, and they're paying for the salaries of these appointed board members. We have a board member on that fiscal control board that earns a larger salary than the president of the United States. We have to talk about how that's criminal, right? But more importantly, this debt has never been audited. And it's like you going to a restaurant and being told to pay $1 amount for a meal you ate and not getting a receipt. Are you going to pay that bill? No, we all want to see receipts. We want to understand what we are paying into. And unfortunately, the people of Puerto Rico don't have receipts. And so there is some major financial concerns, but more importantly, there's no real opportunity in Puerto Rico for employment, for education, right? People don't see a future on their island. For those who have come, what we've seen is that many of the people who have left Puerto Rico are parents. They uprooted families, many of them living in Orlando, Florida, many of them in Georgia, many of them in New York, and here in Chicago. What these people are thinking about is a future for their children. And unfortunately, they don't see it in Puerto Rico. And so there's much to be dealt with on the island. If we're going to be talking about people going back, we need to get the debt audited, and we need to remove the fiscal control board and the austerity measures that they have put in place. And then we need a real infrastructure plan. For Puerto Rico, there's this goal by 2050 that Puerto Rico will be using 100% renewable energy. That is a hard thing to imagine, right? 2050, we think it's that's a long time from now. 30 years is not a lot of time to be an island with 100% reusable energy. Now, I believe it can be achieved, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Just to follow up on that, do you think that it would be a lot easier to assert that sovereignty as an independent nation than it would as a state?
Well, I am biased in that question, and I have to be transparent. Politically, I'm an independentista, right? I believe in the independence of Puerto Rico. I've had the privilege of traveling the world and seeing the beauty and what it means for a nation to be sovereign and self-determined. And I believe that Puerto Rico can be self-determined. My very small 100 by 35 island can do it. Because I don't believe that statehood can undo years, a century of colonialism, right? I don't think currently Puerto Ricans are US citizens of the United States. We serve in the Army, we pay our taxes, and we are treated as second-class citizens. I don't know that statehood would change that. Just like it is the same for Black people that live in this country, right? And so we have to truly think about what are some of the systemic things that are in place that wouldn't allow for the dynamic of Puerto Rico to change or the statehood status. Yes, they would have voting rights for the president of the United States, and there are certain privileges that, yes, we can't take away from what it means for Puerto Rico to be a state, right? If Puerto Rico became a state, people who run for president would have to be worried. And I think that that's also why we have to consider why no one has made Puerto Rico a state. Think about it. There are elections every 4 years in Puerto Rico, and they ask that very question. There have been many elections where the overwhelming majority of people in Puerto Rico say they want to be a state, and nothing happens. Nothing happens, right? And so there are also, on a federal level, systemic concerns of what it would mean to make Puerto Rico a state. We would change the dynamic. And I don't know if anyone's ready for that. But personally, I think if we're talking about decolonizing our island, not just the physical sense of Puerto Rico belonging to a nation, but decolonizing the minds of Puerto Ricans, Puerto Rico has to be sovereign.
Thank you for that, Jessie. I agree with you.
Oh, question for you, Jessie. Are there any mechanism in place to manage outsiders and corporations from buying land in the island?
No, unfortunately, there's not. So when the Jones Act was passed in Puerto Rico, everything that is bought, brought, shipped to and from Puerto Rico is US marked, right? And so if there were ever any parameters put in place on what corporations buy up property, even the tax levels they pay and where they have their business, those parameters are set forth by the Congress and the Senate of the United States. And unfortunately, we've seen it, right, that many of the successful corporations of the US are on foreign land, right? Because they get those tax breaks, because they make more profit, because they could pay less wages. And unfortunately, it's very true for the island of Puerto Rico. Corporations set foot on the island, they get tax breaks, they pay less wages, they make more profit.
Actually,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, to follow up on Carlos' question and your views on independence, do you know if there's any other independent islands or countries out there that model what like an ideal independent Puerto Rico would look like?
There are many models of what independence can look like. I mean, Puerto Rico could have its own democracy system. Puerto Rico could follow the steps of Cuba and be a socialist country. And to be honest, that's what many people fear, right? When people think of Puerto Rico being an independent nation, Cuba is their worst nightmare, right? But there are many ways to be a self-sovereign country. I mean, one can be a republic. Look at the country of Costa Rica, right? There's no one answer to what it means to be an independent nation. I mean, Puerto Rico could be an independent nation and have a relationship with the United States. It's not, what many people believe is that independence also means severing all ties with the United States. That's not what I ever believe. I believe that Puerto Rico should have healthy, meaningful, and equitable relationships with every nation in the world, but that they should be self-sovereign and self-governed and be able to determine their own future and the systems that uphold their values. And so there is no one way to really think about how Puerto Rico could be an independent nation. In fact, there are many independence movements on the island who have very different perspectives on what that looks like. And so while many of us do progressive and radical work and are independentistas, there are many people in the independence movements who have our differences, right? Who do not view what that process should look like in the same way.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Jessie or comments? I have a couple more minutes.
Yeah. Participants can also feel free to put things in the chat. I will put my email here for folks that may be interested in doing work for the Puerto Rican agenda or for anything in Puerto Rico.
Yes, also, when you have some time, if you don't have it now, but if you can send us some information when you talked about how we can support Puerto Rico and especially, give support to the artists there. And, if you can send us those resources, that would be great.
Yeah. No, I have plenty of links of artesanos who sell art in Puerto Rico. I mean, there is, when you talk about coffee, I don't know how many people even drink coffee here, but to think about supporting the coffee industry of Puerto Rico, I mean, think about how much money you spend here if you drink Bustelo. Bustelo is expensive. And so thinking about supporting even the coffee industry in Puerto Rico. Someone said coffee from Hurtado is delicious. I do not disagree. It is delicious. I think coffee all over Puerto Rico is delicious though.
That's great, because what we will do is what we have been doing with all the presentation is we put in our website, the LCC website, we will have the video of your presentation there and also a list of resources, so we can add that too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I will send that over.
Okay. So just to be mindful of time, it's 5:29. Thank you, Jessie, for, again, for expanding our awareness on the devastating events that have occurred in Puerto Rico since 2017.
Yeah.
Which there are many besides Maria. And the human crisis that these have produced in relation to the island colonial relationship with the United States. But also, you touch on the creative solutions that people are implementing on the ground to survive the moment and rebuild Puerto Rico. And that's also always, very important for us to keep in mind, because that's what, show us the resiliency of people and how our support, right, can ensure that happens. I will also like to thank the student panelists, the LCC and the house staff, and to all listening and sharing a space and intention today to build and sustain a collective solidarity that is needed to resolve this environmental and climate crisis in Puerto Rico and many other parts of Latin America, the Caribbean, here in the United States, and frankly, all over the world. Right?
Yeah.
So I hope you can join us in our next and final Climates of Inequality presentation scheduled for Wednesday, November 18th at 4:30. Our guest speaker will be Cheryl Johnson with People for Community Recovery, working in Elgin Gardens. They're addressing environmental racism and climate justice through their work there. And you can register in the LCC website for the next event. And also, like I said before, this is where you will find a recording for all the presentations. So yeah, have a good evening, everyone, and try to enjoy what is left of the some warm days, right? A little bit. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.